Thomas Phillips wiped grease from his hands as wealthy customers sneered at him in his humble garage, seeing nothing more than a poor mechanic they could humiliate without consequence. What they didn't know was that this man in coveralls, secretly, owned the very companies that funded their luxury lifestyles. When Richard Worthington Jr., the entitled heir to what he believed was his family's automotive empire, launched a vicious campaign to teach Thomas about knowing his place, he had no idea he was declaring war on the man who actually controlled his future, his inheritance, and everything he thought he was entitled to. This is the story of what happens when someone mistakes quiet dignity for weakness and discovers that the person they've been tormenting holds their destiny in hands stained with honest work. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The alarm clock's harsh buzz cut through the pre-dawn quiet of the small apartment above Phillips Auto Repair. Thomas Phillips reached across the narrow bed, silencing the noise before it could disturb the peaceful silence that blanketed Ridgefield, West Virginia. 5:30 in the morning came early, but it had been his routine for 8 years now, ever since he'd made the decision that would puzzle everyone who knew his real story. Thomas swung his legs over the side of the bed, his bare feet touching the cold hardwood floor. The modest apartment reflected the life he'd chosen to live, furnished with second-hand pieces and memories of his late wife, Sarah. Her photograph sat on the nightstand, the frame worn smooth from years of his fingers tracing its edges during sleepless nights. The expensive watch hidden in his sock drawer remained unworn, a reminder of the world he'd deliberately left behind. The bathroom mirror showed a man who looked every bit the part of a small-town mechanic. Gray threaded through his brown hair, and permanent grease stains marked his calloused hands, despite the industrial soap he used religiously. Lines around his eyes spoke of years spent squinting under car hoods, though they'd actually come from boardroom meetings and legal documents in his previous life. Thomas splashed cold water on his face, watching the man in the mirror who existed between two worlds. Downstairs, the garage held the familiar smell of motor oil, rubber, and the metallic tang of worn tools. Thomas unlocked the bay doors as the first hints of sunrise painted the mountains surrounding Ridgefield in soft gold. The town was stirring to life, factory whistles echoing across the valley as the morning shift prepared for another day of honest work. This was the world Thomas had chosen, the community he'd embraced when grief had driven him to seek meaning beyond profit margins and quarterly reports. Maria Castillo's battered Honda Civic pulled into the gravel lot at exactly 6 o'clock, as reliable as the sunrise itself. She emerged, carrying a thermos of coffee and a paper bag that undoubtedly contained homemade breakfast burritos, her way of ensuring Thomas ate something substantial before diving into the day's work. Maria had been his anchor during the transition, the woman who'd helped him understand that working with his hands could heal wounds that money never could. "Morning, Thomas," Maria called, her voice carrying the warmth that had made her indispensable to both the shop and his sanity. "Roberto's got that history test today, so he'll be here after school to help with the Henderson transmission." "Good morning, Maria. Tell him good luck from me." Thomas accepted the coffee gratefully, inhaling the rich aroma that seemed to chase away the last remnants of restless sleep. "Mrs. Williams is bringing her car in around 9. Starter's been giving her trouble." Maria nodded, hanging her purse on the hook behind the counter and tying her dark hair back with practiced efficiency. She'd been widowed young, left to raise Roberto alone, while working 2 jobs to keep them afloat. Thomas's shop had become her refuge, a place where her skills were valued and her dedication rewarded fairly. She didn't know that her salary came from dividends that could have purchased the entire block, only that Thomas treated her with respect and paid her well enough to provide for her son's future. The first customer arrived before 7, Mike Reynolds, in his ancient tow truck, needing brake pads replaced before his next county inspection. Thomas enjoyed these early morning jobs, the quiet concentration required to diagnose problems and find solutions. His hands moved with practiced precision, adjusting wrenches and positioning parts with an expertise that had taken decades to develop. The irony wasn't lost on him that he'd spent millions learning business strategy, but found more satisfaction in a $20 brake job than in any acquisition he'd ever orchestrated. "Thomas, you're a lifesaver," Mike said, settling his bill. With cash counted out carefully from a worn wallet. "Don't know what this town would do without you." If Mike only knew the truth, Thomas reflected as the tow truck rumbled away. The secret he carried felt heavier some mornings than others, the weight of maintaining two identities that couldn't be more different. In corporate boardrooms, he'd been Thomas Mitchell, the silent partner whose shell companies controlled automotive empires across 3 states. Here in Ridgefield, he was simply Thomas Phillips, the mechanic who charged fair prices and stood behind his work. The morning progressed with its usual rhythm until the black Mercedes S-Class pulled into the lot at exactly 10:15. Thomas recognized the car immediately, as did the tightening sensation in his chest that accompanied certain visitors. The vehicle belonged to Richard Worthington Jr., the 31-year-old heir apparent to Worthington Luxury Motors, the dealership chain that served as the public face of the automotive empire Thomas actually controlled. Richard emerged from the Mercedes with the fluid confidence of someone who'd never questioned his place in the world. His tailored suit, probably, cost more than most of Thomas's customers earned in a month, and his perfectly styled blonde hair caught the morning sunlight like a halo of privilege. Behind him came Jake Thompson, the sales manager whose nervous energy suggested he'd rather be anywhere else than accompanying Richard on whatever mission had brought them to this working-class neighborhood. "Well, well," Richard's voice carried, the particular blend of amusement and condescension that Thomas had learned to recognize over the years. "So this is the famous Phillips Auto Repair. Jake here tells me you're the man to see about quality work." Thomas straightened from the engine. He'd been examining, wiping his hands on the shop rag tucked into his belt. "Can I help you gentlemen with something?" "Actually, yes." Richard's smile never reached his cold blue eyes as he gestured toward his Mercedes. "I've got a little problem with my car. Nothing major, just some unusual noises that have my regular." Mechanic stumped. Jake suggested I might want to get a second opinion from someone with real experience. The emphasis on the word real carried subtle mockery, as if Richard found it amusing to seek help from someone he clearly considered beneath his social standing. Thomas had encountered this attitude countless times in his current life, the assumption that because he worked with his hands, he must somehow be less intelligent or capable than those who worked with money and influence. "I'd be happy to take a look," Thomas replied evenly, his voice betraying none of the complex emotions churning beneath his calm exterior. "What kind of noises are you hearing?" "Oh, you know how it is with these luxury vehicles," Richard said, running his manicured fingers along the Mercedes hood. "Sometimes they develop little quirks that require a certain level of expertise to properly diagnose. I'm sure someone with your background understands the challenges of working on really expensive machinery." Jake shifted uncomfortably beside. His boss, clearly recognizing the patronizing tone, even if he couldn't bring himself to intervene. Thomas had learned enough about the dealership's internal dynamics to know that Jake was one of the decent employees, someone who worked hard and treated customers fairly regardless of their economic status. Unfortunately, Jake also needed his job and couldn't afford to challenge Richard's behavior openly. "Why don't you start her up and let me listen?" Thomas suggested, keeping his response professional despite the deliberate provocations. Richard slid behind the wheel and turned the ignition, the Mercedes purring to life with the smooth precision. Of German engineering. Thomas listened carefully, his trained ear detecting the subtle irregularities that suggested a problem with the timing chain tensioner. It was a relatively minor issue, easily fixed with the right parts and about 3 hours of careful work. "I can hear what's bothering you," Thomas said as Richard shut off the engine. "Timing chain tensioner's starting to wear. It's not urgent, but you'll want to address it before it gets worse." "Timing chain tensioner," Richard repeated, his tone suggesting he found Thomas's diagnosis questionable. "Are you sure about that? I mean, this is a very sophisticated piece of machinery. The technicians at our service department have advanced diagnostic equipment, computer systems that can pinpoint problems with absolute precision. Sometimes the best diagnostic equipment is right here." Thomas tapped his ear gently. "Experience teaches you to hear things that computers might miss." Richard's laugh held an edge of disbelief. "Well, I suppose that's one way to look at it, though I have to wonder if someone who works in a place like this really has the proper training to work on a vehicle worth more than most people's houses." The insult hung in the air between them, carefully crafted to sound like friendly skepticism while delivering maximum humiliation. Thomas felt Maria stiffen behind the counter where she'd been pretending to organize paperwork, her protective instincts triggered by Richard's obvious attempt to belittle her boss. Jake stared at his shoes, his discomfort palpable as his employer's behavior grew increasingly inappropriate. "I've worked on quite a few expensive vehicles over the years," Thomas replied, his voice maintaining its steady calm. "But I understand if you'd prefer to take it somewhere else. Sometimes trust is as important as technical skill." "Oh, I'm not questioning your abilities," Richard said with false sincerity. "I'm just making sure we're all on the same page about what we're dealing with here. This isn't some pickup truck that can be fixed with duct tape and prayer. This requires precision, attention to detail, the kind of training that comes from working with the finest automotive technology." Thomas nodded slowly, recognizing the game Richard was playing. This wasn't really about car repair at all. This was about establishing dominance, about putting the working-class mechanic in his proper place, while demonstrating Richard's superior understanding of quality and sophistication. It was a performance designed to reinforce the social hierarchy that Richard believed gave him the right to treat service workers as entertainment. "I understand your concerns," Thomas said finally. "The estimate would be $800. For parts and labor, and I could have it finished by tomorrow afternoon. But if you'd be more comfortable taking it to your regular service department, I completely understand." Richard's eyes lit up with something approaching delight, as if Thomas had just provided him with exactly the opening he'd been hoping for. $800 for a timing chain tensioner, that seems rather steep for this type of establishment. I mean, I was expecting more competitive pricing from a place that doesn't have the overhead of a luxury dealership. "The part itself is expensive," Thomas explained patiently. "Mercedes uses a specific design that requires original equipment parts. The labor involves removing several components to access the tensioner properly. It's detailed work that takes time to do correctly." "Detailed work," Richard mused, his tone suggesting he found the concept amusing when applied to Thomas's capabilities. "Yes, I suppose it would be quite challenging for someone without access to the proper facilities. Tell me, do you even have the specialized tools required for European luxury vehicles?" Thomas gestured toward the well-organized tool chest that dominated one corner of the garage. "I believe I have everything necessary." "Believe?" Richard seized on the word like a hawk spotting prey. "That's interesting, because this kind of work requires absolute certainty. One mistake, one wrong torque specification, and we're looking at thousands of dollars in additional damage. Are you prepared to guarantee your work to that extent?" The question was designed to corner Thomas, to force him into either backing down or making promises that Richard could later use against him. It was the kind of aggressive negotiation tactic that Thomas had seen countless times in business meetings, though rarely applied so crudely in a simple service transaction. "I guarantee all my work," Thomas replied simply. "If there's a problem with the repair, I'll make it right." "Make it right," Richard repeated thoughtfully. "And if making it right involves replacing a damaged engine, or if your repair causes additional problems that affect the vehicle's performance, can you really afford to back up that guarantee when we're talking about a car worth more than this entire shop?" The mathematical precision of Richard's cruelty was almost impressive in its thoroughness. He'd managed to question Thomas's competence, his equipment, his financial stability, and his professional integrity in the span of a few carefully crafted sentences. It was a masterclass in using economic advantage as a weapon, deployed against someone Richard assumed couldn't fight back. "I think you'd be better served by your regular dealership," Thomas said quietly, stepping back from the Mercedes. "They'll have the specialized equipment and the manufacturer backing that seems important to you." Richard's smile broadened with satisfaction, the look of someone who'd successfully established his dominance over a social inferior. "You know what? I think you're absolutely right. This kind of work really does require the proper facilities and trained professionals. Jake, make a note to remind me to tell the service department about this conversation. I'm sure they'll find it educational." As the Mercedes pulled away, Thomas stood in his garage doorway, watching the expensive car disappear around the corner. Maria approached cautiously, her face flushed with anger at what she'd witnessed. "That man is a complete bastard," she said bluntly. "The way he talked to you, like you were some kind of idiot who didn't know a wrench from a screwdriver." Thomas nodded slowly, already knowing that Richard Worthington Jr. had just made the biggest mistake of his privileged life. The entitled heir had no idea that the humble mechanic he'd just humiliated owned 73% of Worthington Luxury Motors through a complex web of shell companies and investment vehicles. He didn't know that Thomas's signature on the right document could end his career, his inheritance, and his family's control of the business they'd built their identity around. But he was about to learn, and the education would be far more expensive than any timing chain tensioner repair. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The following Monday arrived with the kind of bitter cold that made every breath visible and every metal surface dangerous to touch with bare skin. Thomas had been working under the hood of Patricia Williams's sedan when he heard the familiar rumble of expensive engines pulling into his lot. Through the gaps in the raised hood, he could see 3 luxury vehicles arranging themselves like predators circling prey. Richard Worthington Jr. emerged from the lead Mercedes, flanked by 2 men Thomas didn't recognize. Their suits were tailored, their shoes polished to mirrors, and their expressions carried the casual arrogance of people accustomed to getting their way through intimidation rather than persuasion. Behind them, Jake Thompson climbed reluctantly from the second vehicle, his face already showing the strain of whatever Richard had planned. "Phillips," Richard called across the garage, his voice echoing off the concrete walls. "I hope you don't mind us dropping by unannounced. I've been telling my associates here about our conversation last week, and they were curious to meet the mechanic who thinks he can work on luxury vehicles." Thomas straightened slowly, setting down his wrench with deliberate calm. Dr. Patricia Williams, who'd been waiting for her starter repair, looked nervously between the approaching group and Thomas. She'd been coming to his shop for 3 years, trusting him with everything from oil changes to transmission rebuilds, and she could sense the tension building like electricity before a storm. "Gentlemen," Thomas nodded politely. "What can I do for you?" "Actually, it's more about what we can do for you," said the taller of Richard's companions, a man with silver hair and predatory eyes. "My name is Derek Walsh. I develop commercial real estate throughout the valley. Richard here mentioned you might be interested in discussing the future of this property." The implication hit like a physical blow. Thomas understood immediately that this wasn't a social visit or even a business proposition. This was the beginning of a systematic campaign designed to pressure him out of his chosen life. Richard had decided that humiliating Thomas once wasn't sufficient. He wanted to destroy the foundation of everything Thomas had built in Ridgefield. "I'm not interested in selling," Thomas replied evenly, though his hands remained steady on the tools he'd been using. "Well, that's the thing about real estate," Derek continued with practiced smoothness. "Sometimes what we want and what makes financial sense don't align perfectly. This area is changing, property values are shifting, and sometimes it's better to get ahead of market forces rather than let them overtake you." Dr. Williams stepped forward, her medical training giving her an instinct for recognizing dangerous situations. "Thomas, I can come back later if this isn't a good time." "No need to leave," Richard said quickly, his smile containing all the warmth of winter steel. "Actually, Dr. Williams, isn't it? I recognize you from the hospital. This conversation might interest you too. We're discussing the kind of neighborhood changes that affect everyone who relies on local businesses." The threat was expertly crafted, subtle enough to maintain plausible deniability while clear enough to communicate intent. Richard was suggesting that Thomas's customers might find themselves inconvenienced if certain changes occurred in the area. It was economic warfare disguised as friendly conversation. "What exactly are you proposing?" Thomas asked, though he already suspected the answer. The third member of Richard's group, a heavy-set man with thick-rimmed glasses, opened a leather briefcase and removed a stack of official-looking documents. "I'm Howard Phillips. No relation. I assume I represent several businesses interested in acquiring properties in this commercial district. We are prepared to make you a very generous offer for your building and business." "Very generous," Derek echoed. "Well above current market value, enough to relocate anywhere you'd like, maybe somewhere more suited to your particular type of operation." Thomas accepted the papers, scanning the numbers with an expression that revealed nothing of his thoughts. The offer was indeed generous by local standards, though it represented a fraction of what he spent monthly on maintaining his legitimate businesses. More importantly, it represented Richard's opening move in what he clearly intended to be a war of attrition. "I'll need time to consider this," Thomas said finally, handing the documents back. "Of course," Howard replied smoothly, "though I should mention that opportunities like this tend to be time-sensitive. Market conditions change, investor interest shifts. We wouldn't want you to miss out on such favorable terms." Dr. Williams watched the exchange with growing alarm. She'd lived in Ridgefield long enough to recognize the kind of pressure tactics that had driven other small businesses out of the downtown area. The polite language couldn't disguise the underlying message: sell voluntarily or face consequences that would make selling inevitable. "Thomas," she said quietly, "maybe you should talk to a lawyer before making any decisions." Richard's laugh was sharp and dismissive. "Oh, I don't think legal advice is necessary for such a straightforward transaction. We're all reasonable people here, trying to find mutually beneficial solutions." "Still," Dr. Williams persisted, her voice gaining strength, "major decisions like this deserve careful consideration. Thomas, you know my husband handles real estate law. I could ask him to review anything before you sign." The offer of help seemed to trigger something ugly in Richard's expression. His carefully maintained facade of friendliness cracked slightly, revealing the entitled rage that simmered beneath his polished exterior. "Dr. Williams, I appreciate your concern for your mechanic." Richard's emphasis on the word mechanic carried obvious condescension. "But this is really a business matter between adults. I'm sure Thomas here is capable of understanding a simple real estate transaction without needing his customers to hold his hand. The insult was designed to accomplish multiple objectives simultaneously. It demeaned Thomas's intelligence, undermined his relationship with a loyal customer, and established Richard's perceived superiority over both the mechanic and the woman who dared to support him. It was a masterclass in social aggression, calculated to isolate Thomas from his community support system. Thomas felt something shift inside his chest, a cold anger that he hadn't experienced since his corporate days when competitors had mistaken his quiet approach for weakness. But this was different. This wasn't about market share or quarterly profits. This was about the life he'd chosen, the community he'd embraced, and the people who depended on him. "Dr. Williams is right," Thomas said calmly. "Any major decision deserves careful consideration. I appreciate your offer, but I'm not interested in selling." Derek's friendly expression hardened slightly. "Perhaps you don't understand the broader picture here. This entire commercial district is being redeveloped. Property taxes are going to increase significantly as values rise. Environmental regulations are becoming more stringent for automotive repair facilities. Insurance costs are climbing due to liability concerns." Each point was delivered with the precision of someone who'd researched exactly how to apply maximum pressure. Thomas recognized the strategy immediately. Create multiple sources of financial stress simultaneously, making resistance seem futile while presenting surrender as the logical choice. Plus, Howard added helpfully, there are new zoning considerations being discussed at the city level. Auto repair facilities might face restrictions on their operations in mixed-use commercial areas. Better to sell while you still have a viable business than wait until regulatory changes make your operation uneconomical. The mention of zoning changes suggested that Richard's influence extended into local government, adding another layer of threat to an already complex situation. Thomas understood that he was facing more than just economic pressure. This was a coordinated campaign designed to overwhelm his ability to resist through sheer volume of problems. Jake Thompson, who had remained silent throughout the conversation, finally spoke up. "Richard, maybe we should let Mr. Phillips think about this without pressure. It's a big decision." The suggestion earned Jake a withering look from his employer. "Jake, I don't think anyone asked for your input on real estate strategy. Perhaps you should wait in the car while the adults finish their conversation." The public humiliation of his own employee demonstrated Richard's willingness to destroy anyone who showed even minimal independence. Jake's face flushed red with embarrassment and anger, but he understood that his job security depended on accepting Richard's treatment without protest. "Actually," Dr. Williams interjected with ice. In her voice, "I think Mr. Thompson made an excellent point. Pressuring someone into major financial decisions is hardly professional behavior." Richard turned his full attention to Dr. Williams, his expression shifting into something openly hostile. "Doctor, I'm beginning to wonder if you fully understand your position here. You're a customer, not a business advisor. Perhaps you should focus on your medical practice and leave commercial real estate to people who actually understand these matters." "I understand bullying when I see it," Dr. Williams replied firmly, "and I understand that small businesses like Thomas's are what make communities like Ridgefield worth living in." The defiance seemed to surprise Richard, as if he couldn't quite believe that anyone would challenge his authority so directly. For a moment, his mask slipped completely, revealing the spoiled child beneath the expensive suit. "Bullying," Richard's voice rose slightly. "Lady, this is business, real business, involving real money and real consequences, not some fantasy where everyone gets to play whatever role makes them feel good about themselves." Thomas stepped forward, positioning himself between Richard and Dr. Williams. "I think this conversation is over. You've made your offer, I've given you my answer. Unless you need automotive service, there's nothing else to discuss." "Oh, but there is," Derek said smoothly, apparently deciding to escalate rather than retreat. "Because this offer won't remain open indefinitely. Market conditions change, opportunities disappear. It would be unfortunate if you found yourself facing more difficult circumstances later." The threat was now completely in the open, stripped of any pretense of friendly negotiation. Thomas looked into Derek's eyes and saw the kind of casual cruelty that treated other people's livelihoods as chess pieces in games they didn't even know they were playing. "Are you threatening me?" Thomas asked quietly. "Threatening?" Derek laughed, as if the suggestion was absurd. "I'm simply pointing out economic realities. Businesses succeed or fail based on market forces. Sometimes those forces can be unpredictable." Maria Castillo, who had been listening from behind the counter while pretending to work on invoices, finally reached her breaking point. "You people need to leave now." Richard turned toward her with obvious amusement. "And who exactly are you to make demands? The secretary?" "I'm someone who works for a living," Maria shot back, her voice shaking with anger. "Someone who knows the difference between honest business and whatever this is supposed to be." "How refreshing," Richard said mockingly. "The help has opinions about business strategy. Tell me, sweetheart, do you have any relevant education or experience in commercial real estate? Or are you just another working-class hero who thinks passion matters more than expertise?" The dismissive cruelty of calling Maria sweetheart while questioning her intelligence pushed Thomas past his breaking point. 8 years of maintaining his cover, 8 years of accepting condescension and disrespect, suddenly felt like too much to bear. "Gentlemen," Thomas said, his voice carrying a new edge that made everyone in the garage pay attention, "I need you to leave my property. Now." "Your property?" Richard's eyebrows rose in exaggerated surprise. "How impressive, though I have to wonder how long that ownership will last once you understand what you're really up against here." The parting shot was delivered with obvious relish, as Richard and his companions made their way toward their vehicles. But as they reached their cars, Richard turned back with one final observation. "You know, Phillips, I actually admire your stubbornness. It's going to make what happens next so much more educational for everyone involved." As the luxury vehicles pulled away, Thomas stood in his garage doorway, watching their retreat while his mind calculated possibilities and responses. Dr. Williams approached him cautiously, her face creased with concern. "Thomas, those men weren't making idle threats. Whatever they're planning, you're going to need help." Thomas nodded slowly, understanding that Richard Worthington Jr. had just declared war on the wrong man. The entitled heir had no idea that the humble mechanic he was trying to destroy controlled not only the dealership empire that employed him, but also the real estate development companies, the banks, and the political connections that Richard thought gave him power. The education Richard had promised was indeed about to begin, but the student wouldn't be who he expected. 3 days after the real estate ambush, Thomas arrived at his shop to find a city inspector's notice taped to his front door. The official seal of Ridgefield's Department of Environmental Compliance stood out starkly against the yellow paper, announcing a mandatory inspection scheduled for the following morning. Thomas read the dense legal language twice, noting the specific concerns about hazardous waste disposal and groundwater contamination that would require extensive documentation to address. Inside the garage, Maria was already brewing coffee and sorting through a stack of mail that had accumulated over the weekend. Her usually cheerful demeanor seemed strained, and Thomas noticed the way she kept glancing toward the windows, as if expecting unwelcome visitors. "Roberto had some trouble at school yesterday," she said without preamble. Not looking up from the Invoices she was organizing. Some kids started saying things about where I work, asking if I was proud to help pollute the environment. Thomas felt a familiar, cold anger settling in his chest. The speed and precision of Richard's campaign was impressive in its thoroughness, reaching even into the high school social dynamics that governed Maria's son's daily life. It demonstrated a level of strategic thinking that Thomas recognized from his own corporate experience. "What kind of things?" Thomas asked gently, though he already suspected the answer. "Stuff about auto shops being dirty, mechanics being criminals who dump oil wherever they want. Roberto tried to defend you, got into an argument with some kid whose father works at the bank." Maria's voice carried the exhaustion of someone fighting battles on multiple fronts. "I told him to ignore it, but you know how teenagers are. They don't understand why adults play these games." The bank connection wasn't coincidental. Thomas had noticed unusual delays in his business loan payments being processed, small bureaucratic hiccups that individually meant nothing but collectively suggested systematic interference. Someone with influence was making phone calls, applying pressure at pressure points throughout the local business ecosystem. Frank McMahon pushed through the front door carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the grim expression of someone bearing bad news. The diner owner had been Thomas's closest friend in Ridgefield, a relationship built on early morning conversations and shared appreciation for honest work. Frank's weathered face showed the strain of whatever information he'd come to deliver. "Tom, we need to talk," Frank said, setting one coffee cup on the counter and keeping the other wrapped protectively in his large hands. "There's rumors going around that you might want to hear about." "What kind of rumors?" Thomas asked, though the sinking feeling in his stomach suggested he already knew. "People are saying your shop might be cutting corners on environmental regulations. Word is that someone reported seeing you dumping used oil behind the building." Frank's voice carried the weight of someone forced to repeat accusations he didn't believe. "Course, anyone who knows you knows that's complete garbage, but rumors don't care about facts." Thomas nodded slowly, recognizing another piece of Richard's strategy. Environmental violations carried serious penalties and could force a business closure, even if the charges were eventually proven false. The investigation process alone would be expensive and time-consuming, creating exactly the kind of pressure that made selling seem like the logical choice. "Who's spreading these rumors?" Maria asked, her protective instincts fully activated. "Hard to say for sure," Frank replied carefully, "but I heard it from Betty Thompson, who heard it from someone at the bank, who heard it from someone else. You know how these things work. The chain of information flow suggested careful orchestration rather than random gossip. Someone was seeding specific stories into the community's communication networks, ensuring that damaging allegations would spread while maintaining enough distance to avoid direct accountability." "There's more," Frank continued reluctantly. "City Council's got a special meeting scheduled for next week, something about updating commercial zoning regulations for automotive businesses. Word is they're concerned about environmental impact and want to implement new restrictions." Thomas understood immediately that Richard's influence extended into local government, allowing him to create regulatory pressure to complement his economic warfare. The timing was too convenient to be coincidental, the specific focus too targeted. To be general policy reform. The shop's phone rang, interrupting their conversation. Maria answered with her usual professional courtesy, but her expression quickly shifted to confusion and then anger. "Phillips Auto Repair, how can I help you?" Maria's voice grew increasingly strained as she listened to whoever was on the other end. "No, we absolutely do not dump waste illegally. No, I cannot confirm that we've been cited for violations because we haven't been cited for anything." She finally hung up with obvious frustration. Reporter from some regional newspaper wanted to ask about environmental compliance issues and whether we had any comment on the investigation. "What investigation?" Thomas asked, though he suspected this was another manufactured crisis designed to create the appearance of legitimacy around Richard's attacks. "That's what I asked her," Maria replied. "She said she'd received information from concerned citizens about potential violations and wanted to get our side of the story before publishing anything." The media involvement represented a significant escalation. Bad publicity could damage Thomas's reputation permanently, even if the allegations were eventually proven false. Once stories appeared in print, they acquired a life of their own, becoming references for future articles and background information for anyone researching the business. Dr. Williams entered the shop, carrying her car keys and wearing the determined expression of someone who'd made an important decision. Her usual calm demeanor seemed charged with purpose, and Thomas noticed she was carrying a folder of documents under her arm. "Thomas, I've been thinking about our conversation the other day," she began without preamble. "I talked to my husband about what happened, and he had some interesting observations about the legal aspects of what those men were threatening." She opened the folder and removed several printed pages. "Robert did some research on the companies those men represent. Derek Walsh's development firm has been involved in several questionable land acquisition projects over the past few years, always targeting small businesses, always using similar pressure tactics." Thomas accepted the documents, scanning the detailed information that Dr. Williams and her husband had compiled. The pattern was clear and disturbing. Derek Walsh specialized in acquiring properties from vulnerable small business owners through systematic intimidation, disguised as legitimate business practice. "There's more," Dr. Williams continued. "Robert knows the city attorney personally. He says there's been unusual pressure from certain business interests to fast-track new environmental regulations, specifically targeting auto repair facilities. The confirmation of Richard's political influence wasn't surprising, but having it documented added weight to Thomas's growing understanding of the campaign against him. This wasn't just personal harassment, it was a coordinated effort involving multiple businesses and government connections." "Why are you telling me this?" Thomas asked, though he was grateful for the information. "Because what they're doing is wrong," Dr. Williams replied firmly, "and because small businesses like yours are what keep communities like Ridgefield from becoming corporate wastelands where everything is owned by distant shareholders who don't care about local people." Her passion surprised Thomas, revealing depths of conviction that went beyond simple customer loyalty. Dr. Williams understood that the attack on his shop represented a broader assault on the economic independence that allowed working-class families to build stable lives. Roberto Castillo burst through the front door with the energy of someone carrying urgent news. The 17-year-old worked part-time at the shop after school, learning automotive skills while earning money for college. His usual easygoing demeanor was replaced by obvious agitation. "Mom, Mr. Phillips, you need to hear this," Roberto said breathlessly. "Some guys came by the school today asking questions about where you work. They said they were conducting a survey about local businesses, but it felt weird." "What kind of questions?" Maria asked, her maternal protective instincts fully engaged. "Stuff about whether I thought you followed safety regulations, whether I'd ever seen anything that looked like improper waste disposal. They kept pushing for specific details, like they wanted me to say something incriminating." Roberto's voice carried the confusion of someone too young to understand the sophisticated cruelty he'd encountered. The targeting of Roberto represented a new low in Richard's campaign, using a teenager as a potential source of damaging information against his own mother's employer. It demonstrated a level of ruthlessness that went beyond normal business competition into personal vindictiveness. "Did you tell them anything?" Thomas asked gently. "I told them this is the most honest place I've ever worked, and that you teach me to do everything the right way," Roberta replied with obvious pride, but they kept asking the same questions different ways, like they thought I was lying or hiding something. Frank McMahon's expression had grown increasingly dark during Roberto's recitation. The diner owner understood small-town dynamics well enough to recognize the systematic nature of what was happening. "Tom, this has gone way beyond normal business. Pressure," Frank said quietly. "They're trying to destroy your reputation, your business, and your relationships with people who depend on you. You can't just ignore this and hope it goes away." Thomas nodded, understanding that the time for passive resistance was ending. Richard's campaign had escalated beyond what could be addressed through simple dignity and professionalism. The attacks on Maria's family and the broader community demanded a more decisive response. "There's something else," Dr. Williams said, consulting her folder again. "Robert discovered that Derek Walsh's development company has been acquiring properties throughout this commercial district over the past 18 months. Your shop is one of the last independently owned businesses in a 3-block radius." The information reframed everything Thomas thought he understood about Richard's motivations. This wasn't just personal harassment disguised as business pressure. This was part of a larger strategy to consolidate control over Ridgefield's downtown commercial district, eliminating independent operators who might resist development plans. "So this was never really about my shop specifically," Thomas mused aloud. "It's about clearing the area for redevelopment." "Exactly," Dr. Williams confirmed. "And your shop represents the biggest obstacle because you have loyal customers and deep community ties. If they can force you out, the other remaining businesses will have no choice but to sell." Maria looked up from the appointment book she'd been reviewing. "Thomas, Mrs. Patterson called this morning to cancel her brake job. Said she was taking her car somewhere else from now on. When I asked why, she got all weird and hung up." The customer defections were beginning exactly as Richard had planned. Fear of association with a business under investigation would drive away the customers who formed the economic foundation of the shop's survival. Even customers who didn't believe the allegations would avoid the hassle and potential embarrassment of supporting a controversial business. "How many other cancellations?" Thomas asked, though he dreaded the answer. "3 more calls came in while you were talking to Frank," Maria replied sadly. "People are scared, Thomas. They don't understand what's happening, but they know something bad is going on." Thomas looked around his shop, seeing 8 years of careful relationship building being dismantled through calculated fear and systematic misinformation. The tools and equipment that represented his chosen life, the photographs of satisfied customers that covered one wall, the comfortable familiarity of a workspace arranged exactly to his preferences. All of it was being threatened by someone who had never worked an honest day in his privileged life. But Richard Worthington Jr. had made a crucial mistake in his strategic planning. He'd assumed that Thomas Phillips was exactly what he appeared to be, a working-class mechanic with limited resources and no powerful connections. The entitled heir had no idea that his campaign of destruction was being directed against someone who controlled the very empire that Richard believed gave him his authority. The education Richard had promised was indeed about to begin. But the lesson plan would be very different from what he'd imagined. "Frank, Dr. Williams," Thomas said quietly, "I appreciate everything you've done to help me understand what's happening. But I think it's time for me to handle this situation directly." There was something in Thomas's voice that made everyone in the shop pay attention, a subtle shift in tone that suggested hidden depths and capabilities that none of them had previously suspected. For the first time since Richard's campaign began, Thomas sounded like someone who had options beyond simply enduring whatever punishment his tormentors chose to inflict. The real Thomas Phillips was finally ready to emerge from behind the coveralls and grease-stained hands, and Richard Worthington Jr. was about to discover that some mechanics could dismantle more than just engines. The environmental inspector arrived precisely at 8 o'clock the following morning, clipboard in hand and wearing the officious expression of someone armed with regulatory authority. Jennifer Baker followed 30 minutes later, her press credentials visible and camera ready to document whatever violations the inspection might reveal. The coordination was too perfect to be coincidental, suggesting that Richard's media strategy was operating in lockstep with his regulatory pressure campaign. Inspector Charles Morrison methodically examined every corner of the garage, photographing waste disposal containers and testing soil samples from behind the building. His questions were thorough and technical, designed to uncover any possible infractions that could justify the investigation's existence. Thomas answered each inquiry with professional courtesy, while mentally calculating the costs and delays that even a clean inspection would impose. "Mr. Phillips, I'll need to see your hazardous waste disposal contracts for the past 3 years, Morrison said, consulting his checklist. Also, documentation of any spill incidents, employee safety training records, and environmental impact assessments. Thomas retrieved the requested files from his office, knowing that his paperwork was meticulous and current. The inspector spent an hour reviewing documents that clearly demonstrated full compliance with all regulations, his expression growing increasingly disappointed as each requirement was satisfied completely. Jennifer Baker positioned herself strategically to photograph the inspection process, clearly hoping to capture images that would support whatever story she'd already decided to write. Her questions revealed an obvious bias toward finding environmental problems, repeatedly asking about allegations that existed nowhere except in the rumors Richard's campaign had planted. "Mr. Phillips, how do you respond to community concerns about groundwater contamination?" Baker asked, her camera clicking steadily as she spoke. "There are no community concerns about groundwater contamination," Thomas replied evenly. "There's also no groundwater contamination. Inspector Morrison will confirm that all our waste disposal practices exceed regulatory requirements." Baker's follow-up questions revealed her determination to create controversy regardless of the facts. She asked about reports of illegal dumping that Morrison had already determined were false, concerns about air quality that monitoring equipment showed were unfounded, and allegations of safety violations that the inspection had proven non-existent. "I understand there's been significant community pressure to investigate your business," Baker pressed. "Don't you think residents deserve transparency about potential environmental risks?" "Residents deserve accurate information, not manufactured controversy," Thomas answered, recognizing the loaded questions designed to elicit defensive responses that could be quoted out of context. Inspector Morrison completed his examination by noon, finding 0 violations and confirming that Phillips Auto Repair operated in full compliance with all environmental regulations. His official report would clearly state these findings, but Thomas understood that facts wouldn't stop Richard's propaganda campaign from claiming partial victory simply by forcing the investigation. After Morrison and Baker departed, Thomas found himself alone in the garage for the first time in days. The constant pressure of defending against attacks he hadn't provoked was wearing down his carefully maintained patience. 8 years of choosing the humble mechanic's life over corporate warfare seemed increasingly naive as Richard's campaign intensified. His phone rang with a call from Lisa Rodriguez at Ridgefield Community Bank. Her nervous voice carried bad news that Thomas had been expecting since the financial pressure tactics began. "Mr. Phillips, I need to discuss some concerns that have been raised about your business loan," Lisa said carefully. There have been reports about potential environmental liabilities that might affect the collateral value of your property." "What reports?" Thomas asked, though he already knew the source. "Anonymous complaints filed with the city suggested that your business might be facing regulatory action that could impact your ability to operate," Lisa explained reluctantly. "Bank policy requires us to review loans when borrowers face potential operational restrictions." The financial attack was expertly crafted, using the environmental investigation to create banking concerns that would persist even after the inspection proved Thomas's innocence. Banks avoided risk aggressively, and even unfounded allegations could trigger loan reviews that impose additional costs and restrictions. "Lisa, you've been processing my payments for 3 years without a single issue," Thomas pointed out. "Inspector Morrison just completed a full environmental compliance review and found 0 violations." "I understand, and personally I don't think there's any real problem," Lisa replied. "But the bank's risk management department has procedures they have to follow when certain flags are raised. I'm required to schedule a meeting to review your loan terms." Thomas hung up, feeling the weight of Richard's systematic approach. Every aspect of his business life was being attacked simultaneously, creating multiple crises that demanded time, money, and emotional energy to resolve. The strategy was designed to overwhelm his capacity to respond effectively while maintaining enough legal cover to avoid obvious criminality. Maria returned from lunch carrying a newspaper and wearing an expression of barely controlled fury. She slammed the Ridgefield Herald onto the counter hard enough to make the coffee cups jump, pointing at a front-page article that bore Jennifer Baker's byline. "Local auto shop under environmental investigation," read the headline, followed by 3 paragraphs that carefully avoided making direct accusations while strongly implying guilt through selective quotation and innuendo. Baker had quoted "community" concerns without identifying their source, referenced ongoing regulatory review without mentioning its clean results, and described questions about waste disposal practices without noting they'd been answered satisfactorily. "This is character assassination," Maria said angrily. "Every word technically true, but designed to make you look guilty of something." Thomas read the article twice, admiring its professional malice despite his anger. Baker had created the impression of serious environmental problems while including enough qualifying language to avoid libel charges. Anyone who read quickly would come away believing that Phillips Auto Repair was under investigation for contaminating the community's water supply. "Roberto's already hearing about this at school," Maria continued. "Kids asking if his mom works for the place that's poisoning the river. I swear, Thomas, if this keeps affecting my son." She didn't finish the threat, but Thomas understood that his decision to maintain his cover was imposing costs on people who didn't deserve to suffer for his choices. The attack on Roberto represented a line that Richard shouldn't have crossed, targeting a teenager for his mother's loyalty to her employer. The shop's phone began ringing with cancellation calls 20 minutes after the newspaper hit the streets. Customer after customer offered polite excuses about taking their vehicles elsewhere, unable to directly mention the article, but clearly influenced by its implications. Thomas watched 3 years of relationship-building dissolve as fear and uncertainty drove away the people who had trusted him with their transportation needs. By 3 o'clock, 8 appointments had been cancelled and no new customers had appeared. The garage felt eerily quiet, lacking the usual buzz of activity that marked a successful automotive business. Thomas sat at his desk, calculating how long he could survive without revenue while maintaining his current overhead expenses. David. Price appeared in the doorway looking nervous and apologetic. The young Sterling employee had clearly struggled with the decision to visit, understanding that any association with Thomas could jeopardize his own position. His presence required courage that Thomas respected. especially given the obvious risks. "Mr. Phillips, I wanted to apologize for what's been happening," David said quietly, glancing around to ensure they wouldn't be overheard. "What Mr. Worthington is doing to you, it's wrong." "Why are you telling me this?" Thomas asked, though he appreciated David's moral clarity. "Because someone should know that not everyone at Sterling supports this campaign," David replied. "There are people in the company who think Mr. Worthington has gone too far, who understand that targeting small businesses like this reflects badly on all of us." The information suggested internal dissent within Richard's organization, though Thomas suspected it wouldn't significantly impact the attacks. Richard's sense of entitlement wouldn't be modified by employee concerns about ethics or public relations. "Has he said anything specific about his plans?" Thomas asked. David hesitated before answering. "He's been bragging about how easy it is to destroy someone's reputation when you know the right people to call. He seems to think you'll be out of business within a month." "And what do you think?" Thomas asked, curious about David's assessment of the situation. "I think he's underestimating you," David replied with surprising conviction. "The way you handle pressure, the way you treat people with respect regardless of how they treat you, that's not how someone acts when they're scared or helpless." The observation was perceptive enough to make Thomas wonder how much David actually suspected about his background. The young man's intelligence and integrity suggested he might have noticed inconsistencies in the story of Thomas Phillips, humble mechanic with no resources or connections. Frank McMahon arrived carrying dinner from his restaurant and wearing the determined expression of someone who'd made important decisions. He set the food on Thomas's desk and pulled up a chair, settling in for what was clearly intended to be a serious conversation. "Tom, I've been talking to other business owners about what's happening to you," Frank began without preamble. "Nobody likes what they're seeing, but most people are too scared to get involved." "I understand their position," Thomas replied, though the isolation stung more than he wanted to admit. "Well, I don't understand it," Frank said firmly, "and neither do a few others, Betty Thompson, Sam Williams, Joe Kowalski. We've been thinking about ways to support you that don't require anyone to stick their neck out too far." The offer of community solidarity warmed Thomas more than any corporate alliance he'd ever negotiated. These were people with limited resources who were willing to risk their own security to support someone they believed was being treated unjustly. "What did you have in mind?" Thomas asked. "Coordinated support," Frank explained. "All of us bringing our vehicles to you for service, recommending you to friends and family, making sure people know you're operating legitimately despite whatever garbage is being spread around." The grassroots campaign wouldn't match Richard's professional propaganda operation, but it represented something more valuable: genuine community conviction that transcended economic calculation. Thomas felt a surge of emotion at the realization that his chosen life had created relationships that couldn't be bought or intimidated. "Frank, I appreciate that more than you know," Thomas said, "but I don't want anyone taking risks on my behalf." "Too late for that," Frank replied with a grin. "We already decided you're stuck with us. Besides, what's the point of living in a community if you don't fight for the people who make it worth living in?" As evening approached, Thomas found himself reviewing the day's events and calculating his options. Richard's campaign was succeeding in its immediate objectives: damaging his reputation, driving away customers, and creating financial pressure through multiple channels. The systematic approach suggested professional consultation, possibly from the same public relations firms that managed corporate crisis management. But Richard had made crucial miscalculations that revealed his fundamental ignorance about the man he was attacking. He'd assumed that Thomas Phillips was exactly what he appeared to be: a working-class mechanic with limited resources and no powerful connections. He'd failed to consider that someone with Thomas's calm competence under pressure might have capabilities that weren't immediately visible. Most importantly, Richard had underestimated the depth of community loyalty that Thomas had built through 8 years of honest dealing and fair treatment. The relationships that Richard was trying to destroy represented something more valuable than business connections. They were the foundation of a life that Thomas had chosen deliberately over the isolation of extreme wealth. As Thomas locked up the shop that evening, he made the decision that would change everything. Richard Worthington Jr. wanted to play power games, using economic warfare and systematic intimidation. He was about to discover that some games have rules he didn't understand, and some opponents have resources he'd never imagined. The education Richard had promised was finally about to begin, but the lesson would be taught by someone who understood both worlds: the humble community of honest workers and the ruthless realm of corporate power. Thomas Phillips, master mechanic, was ready to introduce Richard to Thomas Mitchell, the man who actually owned everything Richard thought gave him authority. The war Richard had started was about to become very expensive for the wrong side. The breaking point arrived on a Tuesday morning when Thomas discovered his shop's windows covered with graffiti. Someone had spray-painted polluter and poison across the glass in jagged red letters, along with crude drawings suggesting environmental contamination. The vandalism had occurred during the night, precisely timed to greet him with maximum psychological impact as he opened for business. Maria arrived 10 minutes later, took one look at the damage, and immediately began scrubbing the windows with grim determination. "This is getting insane," she muttered, attacking the paint with steel wool and industrial solvent. "They're treating you like some kind of criminal when you're the most honest person in this whole town." Thomas helped her clean the glass while his mind calculated the escalating costs of Richard's campaign. The graffiti represented more than simple vandalism. It was a message that the attacks would continue intensifying until he surrendered. Someone was systematically destroying everything he'd built in Ridgefield, using techniques that suggested professional crisis management consultation. Roberto arrived after school carrying his backpack and wearing the hollow expression of someone who'd endured a difficult day. The 17-year-old usually bounded into the shop with infectious energy, eager to learn new skills and earn money. For college. Today, he moved like someone carrying an invisible weight. "How bad was it today?" Maria asked gently, setting down her cleaning supplies to focus on her son. "3 kids asked if I was ashamed to work for someone who dumps toxic waste in the river," Roberto replied quietly. "When I told them that was completely false, they said their parents saw it in the newspaper, so it must be true." The systematic targeting of Roberto revealed the sophisticated cruelty behind Richard's strategy, attacking a teenager for his mother's. Loyalty demonstrated a willingness to destroy innocent lives in pursuit of business objectives. Thomas felt something cold and dangerous solidifying in his chest as he watched the boy struggle with circumstances beyond his understanding. "Roberto, you don't have to keep working here if it's causing problems at school," Thomas said, though the offer cost him considerable effort to make. "No way," Roberto replied with sudden fire. "That's exactly what they want. They're trying to make everyone abandon you so you'll have to give up. But I know who you really are, Mr. Phillips. You taught me that honest work matters more than what people say about you." The teenager's loyalty stung Thomas with its purity, reminding him that his decision to maintain his cover was imposing costs on people who didn't deserve to suffer for his choices. Roberto's faith in the simple mechanic he believed Thomas to be created an obligation that transcended business strategy. Jennifer Baker returned that afternoon with her photographer in tow, clearly hoping to document the graffiti as evidence supporting her environmental contamination narrative. She positioned herself strategically to capture images of Thomas cleaning the windows, probably planning to use the photos to suggest guilt or desperation. "Mr. Phillips, Do you think this vandalism represents community frustration with environmental concerns? Baker asked, her camera clicking steadily as she spoke. I think this represents community manipulation by people spreading false information, Thomas replied calmly, continuing to scrub paint without looking up. But surely you understand why residents might be concerned about potential groundwater contamination, Baker pressed. Even if the investigation didn't find immediate violations, people worry about long-term effects. The investigation found zero evidence of any environmental problems because there are no environmental problems, Thomas said firmly. Anyone who wants facts instead of rumors can request a copy of Inspector Morrison's report. Baker's questions revealed her determination to maintain the contamination narrative regardless of contradictory evidence. She asked about ongoing concerns that existed nowhere except in her articles, community fears that she'd helped create through biased reporting, and questions about transparency that ignored his complete cooperation with all regulatory requests. Dr. Williams arrived as Baker was leaving, carrying a folder thick with documents and wearing the expression of someone who'd made important discoveries. She waited until the reporter's car disappeared before approaching Thomas with obvious urgency. I've been investigating Derek Walsh's development company more thoroughly, Dr. Williams said, without preamble. What I found is disturbing and possibly illegal. She opened her folder and removed printed copies of public records, financial documents, and legal filings that painted a comprehensive picture of systematic property manipulation. Walsh has been using the same playbook against small business owners throughout 3 counties: environmental allegations, media pressure, regulatory harassment, financial intimidation. Thomas studied the documents, recognizing patterns that confirmed his suspicions about the professional nature of Richard's campaign. How many businesses has he targeted? 17 over the past 4 years, Dr. Williams replied grimly. Auto repair shops, small manufacturers, family restaurants. Always the same sequence. Anonymous complaints, regulatory investigations, negative media coverage, then pressure to sell at below-market prices. The information revealed Richard's strategy as part of a broader pattern of predatory business practices designed to consolidate commercial real estate control. Thomas wasn't being targeted personally. He was simply the latest obstacle to systematic neighborhood transformation. What happened to the other business owners? Thomas asked, though he suspected the answer. 12 sold and relocated outside the county. 3 went bankrupt fighting the legal costs. 2 are still hanging on, but barely surviving. Dr. Williams's voice carried the weight of documented injustice. The pattern is too consistent to be coincidental. This is organized criminal activity disguised as legitimate business practice. Thomas nodded slowly, understanding that Richard had chosen the wrong target for his systematic destruction campaign. The entitled heir had no idea that the humble mechanic he was trying to eliminate controlled not only the dealership that employed him, but also the financial networks and legal resources that Richard thought gave him invincibility. Frank McMahon entered carrying afternoon coffee and wearing the satisfied expression of someone who'd accomplished important tasks. Tom, I've got news that might interest you. Remember I mentioned talking to other business owners about supporting you? Of course, Thomas replied. Well, we did more than talk, Frank said with obvious pride. Betty Thompson organized a petition supporting your business, got over 200 signatures from customers, neighbors, and community members who want everyone to know they trust you completely. He produced a thick stack of papers covered with names and addresses of Ridgefield, residents who'd taken the time to formally express their confidence in Phillips Auto Repair. The grassroots support represented something that couldn't be manufactured or purchased, genuine community conviction based on years of honest dealing. There's more, Frank continued. Sam Williams talked to his union buddies at the factory. Turns out several of them have had their own run-ins with Derek Walsh's pressure tactics. They're organizing their own investigation into his business practices. The labor union involvement added a new dimension to the resistance against Richard's campaign. Factory workers understood economic intimidation instinctively and possessed organizational capabilities that could challenge systematic exploitation effectively. And Joe Kowalski reached out to his contacts in the police department, Frank added. Apparently, there have been several complaints about suspicious activities around your shop lately. Someone's been watching the place, taking photographs, asking neighbors questions about your business practices. The surveillance revelation wasn't surprising, but having it officially documented created opportunities for legal counterattack that Thomas hadn't previously considered. Professional harassment campaigns required coordination that often violated stalking and intimidation laws when properly investigated. David Price appeared in the doorway, looking more nervous than usual. The young Sterling employee clearly struggled with whatever information he'd come to share, understanding that any association with Thomas could cost him his job. His presence demonstrated courage that Thomas respected deeply. "Mr. Phillips, I need to tell you something important," David said quietly, glancing around to ensure privacy. "Mr. Worthington is planning something big for tomorrow. He's been making phone calls all day, talking about a final solution to the mechanic problem." "What kind of final solution?" Thomas asked, though he suspected the answer would be unpleasant. "He's hired some kind of consultant from the city, someone who specializes in forcing business closures through regulatory pressure," David explained. "They're planning to file multiple complaints simultaneously: health department, fire marshal, building inspector, OSHA. The idea is to overwhelm you with so many investigations that you can't possibly satisfy all the requirements." The escalation represented a significant increase in Richard's commitment to destroying Thomas's chosen life. Professional regulatory harassment required expensive consultation and substantial political connections, suggesting that Richard viewed eliminating Phillips Auto Repair as worth considerable investment. "There's something else," David continued, reluctantly. "He's been bragging about having connections in the mayor's office, says he can get your business license revoked based on community safety concerns." The political corruption angle wasn't surprising, but having it confirmed by an insider created evidence that could be used to expose the entire conspiracy. Thomas understood that Richard's overconfidence was creating vulnerabilities that could be exploited by someone with the right resources and legal expertise. "David, why are you telling me this?" Thomas asked. "You're risking your job to warn someone you barely know." "Because what he's doing is wrong," David replied simply, "and because I've seen enough of his behavior to know that if he can destroy you, he'll eventually turn on anyone else who doesn't serve his purposes. Someone has to stand up to him." Thomas felt a surge of respect for David's moral courage, recognizing the same integrity that had drawn him to Ridgefield's working-class community 8 years earlier. The young man's willingness to risk his livelihood for principle demonstrated the values that Richard's privilege had never taught him to understand. As the day ended, Thomas found himself surrounded by evidence of Richard's escalating campaign and the community's growing resistance. The attack on his business had become a referendum on basic fairness, uniting people who might normally have little in common against systematic intimidation and abuse of power. But Richard had made a fatal error in his strategic planning. He'd assumed that escalating pressure would eventually break Thomas's resistance, forcing him to accept defeat and abandon the life he'd chosen. The entitled heir had no concept that some people possessed resources that weren't immediately visible, capabilities that transcended what appeared on financial statements or business licenses. Tomorrow would bring Richard's final assault, The here coordinated regulatory attack designed to overwhelm Thomas's ability to respond. But Richard Worthington Jr. was about to discover that he'd declared war on someone who understood power better than he did, someone who'd been playing these games since before Richard learned to drive his first luxury vehicle. The education Richard had promised was finally about to begin, and the first lesson would be about the difference between inherited privilege and earned authority. Thomas Phillips, master mechanic, was ready to teach Richard Worthington Jr. exactly who controlled. The empire he thought belonged to his family. The time for hiding behind coveralls and grease-stained hands was ending. Tomorrow, Richard would meet the real Thomas Mitchell and learn what it meant to challenge someone who owned everything Richard believed gave him power. The coordinated assault began at 7:30 the following morning when 4 government vehicles arrived simultaneously at Phillips Auto Repair. Health Department, Fire Marshal, Building Inspector, and OSHA representatives emerged carrying clipboards, cameras, and the authority to shut down any business that failed their inspection standards. Richard's final gambit was unfolding with military precision. Thomas watched from his office window as the officials organized their attack, recognizing the professional coordination that suggested expensive consultation. This wasn't random regulatory oversight. This was systematic harassment designed to create more violations than any small business could address simultaneously. Richard's consultant had earned their fee by weaponizing bureaucracy itself. Inspector Williams from the Health Department approached first, her expression carrying the tired resignation of someone forced to participate in political theater. Mr. Phillips, we've received complaints about unsanitary conditions and potential public health hazards. I'm required to conduct a comprehensive inspection of your facility. Of course, Thomas replied professionally, though he understood that the inspection's results had been predetermined regardless of his actual compliance status. I'll provide access to any areas you need to examine. The 4 inspectors spread throughout the garage like occupying forces, photographing normal business operations as if documenting criminal activities. They measured ventilation systems that exceeded requirements, tested air quality in spaces that showed no contamination, and scrutinized disposal practices that Inspector Morrison had already confirmed were exemplary. Fire Marshal Rodriguez focused on storage areas, questioning the placement of equipment that had been arranged according to current safety codes. His questions suggested familiarity with technical violations that most businesses unknowingly committed, minor infractions that rarely triggered enforcement but could justify closure when political pressure demanded results. Mr. Phillips, this pot storage configuration doesn't meet the latest spacing requirements for fire suppression access, Rodriguez announced, photographing shelving that had been professionally installed 3 years earlier. You'll need to reconfigure the entire storage area to maintain your operating license. Building Inspector Jackson examined structural elements that hadn't changed since the facility's original construction approval. Her measurements seemed designed to find dimensional discrepancies that could trigger costly renovation requirements, forcing business closure through financial impossibility rather than legitimate safety concerns. The ventilation system modifications you made last year don't appear on our current building permits, Jackson observed, consulting a tablet that displayed outdated facility records. Any structural changes require specific approval through the Municipal Planning Office. OSHA Representative Thompson concentrated on employee safety protocols, questioning procedures that exceeded federal requirements while searching for documentation gaps that could support violation citations. His approach suggested coaching from someone familiar with regulatory pressure tactics used to eliminate unwanted businesses. Your safety training records show gaps in annual certification updates, Thompson noted, reviewing files that Thomas knew were complete and current. OSHA requires continuous documentation of employee hazard awareness education. Maria watched the coordinated harassment from behind the counter, her face flushed with anger at the obvious injustice being performed under the guise of regulatory compliance. "This is complete garbage," she whispered to Roberto, who'd arrived early to help. "Prepare for the expected assault. They're treating us like criminals when we follow every rule more carefully than most businesses in town." The inspection process consumed 3 hours, during which normal business operations became impossible. Customers who arrived for scheduled appointments were turned away by officials who claimed the facility was unsafe for public access. The message was clear: Phillips Auto Repair was dangerous, under investigation, and should be avoided until authorities determined otherwise. Dr. Williams arrived during the height of the inspection chaos, carrying her folder of research documents and wearing the determined expression of someone prepared for confrontation. She observed the coordinated harassment for several minutes before approaching Inspector Williams with obvious purpose. "Excuse me, Inspector Williams," Dr. Williams said formally. "I'm Dr. Patricia Williams. I've been researching the pattern of complaints that triggered this inspection, and I have some concerns about the legitimacy of the sources." Inspector Williams looked uncomfortable, clearly recognizing that her morning's work was being scrutinized by someone with credentials and intelligence. "Ma'am, we are required to investigate all complaints regardless of their source. Public safety takes precedence over other considerations." "Of course," Dr. Williams replied smoothly. "But I think you should know that these complaints appear to be part of a systematic harassment campaign targeting small businesses throughout the region. I have documentation showing identical language used in complaints against 17 other businesses over the past 4 years." She produced copies of complaint forms that revealed the professional template nature of the allegations against Thomas. The wording was too similar across different businesses and time periods to be coincidental, suggesting coordinated effort rather than genuine community concerns. "Furthermore," Dr. Williams continued, "I have evidence that the company behind this campaign has financial interests in acquiring the properties of businesses they target for regulatory harassment." Inspector Williams studied the documents with growing discomfort, clearly recognizing that she was being used as a weapon in someone else's business war. The revelation that her official authority was being manipulated for private gain obviously troubled her professional ethics. Frank McMahon arrived with Sam Williams and Joe Kowalski, the 3 men representing the core of Thomas's community support network. They positioned themselves strategically around the inspection area, not interfering with official procedures, but making their presence felt as witnesses to whatever was being perpetrated. "Morning, Tom," Frank called across the garage. "Figured you might want some friends around during all this official attention." The community support seemed to irritate Fire Marshal Rodriguez, who approached the group with obvious annoyance. "Gentlemen, this is an active investigation site. I need to ask you to maintain distance from the inspection areas." "We're standing on public property," Sam Williams replied calmly. "Last I checked, Americans still had the right to observe government officials conducting business in their community." Joe Kowalski nodded agreement. "Especially when those officials are harassing local business owners based on complaints that smell like yesterday's fish." The confrontation drew attention from other inspectors, who seemed increasingly uncomfortable with the growing audience for their activities. Professional regulatory harassment worked best in isolation, where intimidated business owners couldn't rally community support or attract unwanted scrutiny. Richard Worthington Jr. arrived at 10:30, clearly expecting to witness Thomas's humiliation and surrender. He emerged from his Mercedes wearing a satisfied smile that suggested complete confidence in his strategy's success. Jake Thompson followed reluctantly, his expression showing the moral discomfort of someone forced to participate in systematic cruelty. "Phillips!" Richard called across the parking lot, his voice carrying the cheerful malice of someone watching an enemy's destruction. "Quite a morning you're having. I hope all these inspections don't interfere too much with your business operations." Thomas looked up from the documentation he'd been reviewing with Inspector Williams, meeting Richard's gaze with calm steadiness that seemed to surprise the entitled heir. "Just routine compliance verification, nothing that honest businesses need to worry about." "Routine," Richard repeated with obvious amusement. "Yes, I suppose it's routine when you're operating the kind of establishment that generates community. Safety concerns." The public gloating revealed Richard's assumption that the inspection process would inevitably produce citations sufficient to justify business closure. His confidence suggested ignorance about the actual compliance status of Thomas's operation, assuming that all small businesses must have violations that aggressive inspection could discover. "Mr. Worthington," Dr. Williams interjected, stepping forward with her research folder clearly visible. "Since you're here, perhaps you'd like to explain your development company's interest in acquiring properties from businesses that coincidentally face regulatory harassment." Richard's smile faltered slightly as he processed the implication of Dr. Williams' question. "I'm sorry, who are you exactly?" "Dr. Patricia Williams. I've been investigating the pattern of complaints that led to today's inspection," she replied professionally. "I find it interesting that Derek Walsh's development company has attempted to purchase properties from 17 businesses that faced identical regulatory pressure over the past 4 years. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from burning bridges, clearly visible to everyone present. Richard's expression shifted from confident amusement to cautious concern as he realized that his systematic approach had created a documented pattern vulnerable to exposure. "I don't know what you're suggesting," Richard said carefully, "but I resent any implication that legitimate business interests are somehow connected to regulatory compliance issues." "I'm not suggesting anything," Dr. Williams replied calmly. "I'm stating facts documented in public records. Your development partners have consistently profited from acquiring properties from businesses that faced coordinated regulatory harassment." Inspector Williams approached Thomas, carrying her completed report and wearing the expression of someone forced to deliver disappointing news to her superiors. "Mr. Phillips, I've completed my health department inspection. Your facility meets or exceeds all applicable standards. I found no violations or grounds for enforcement action." Fire Marshal Rodriguez followed with similar results. "No fire code violations identified. Your safety systems are properly maintained and current with all requirements." Building Inspector Jackson nodded reluctantly. "Structural systems are compliant. The ventilation modifications you mentioned were actually approved under a blanket permit for routine maintenance." OSHA Representative Thompson completed the clean sweep. "Employee safety protocols exceed federal requirements. Documentation is complete and current. The coordinated inspections had produced exactly 0 violations, destroying Richard's strategy of overwhelming Thomas with multiple compliance crises. His expensive consultant's plan had failed completely, leaving him exposed to accusations of harassment while accomplishing nothing except revealing his willingness to abuse government authority for personal gain. Richard's face reddened with fury as he processed the complete failure of his final assault. This is impossible. 4 separate agencies can't all find nothing wrong with a place like this. A place like what? Thomas asked quietly, his voice carrying a new edge that made everyone pay attention. You know exactly what I mean, Richard snapped, his carefully maintained facade finally cracking under the pressure of repeated failure. A run-down garage operated by someone who thinks he can compete with real businesses. The naked contempt in Richard's voice crystallized everything that had been building between them over the past weeks. Thomas understood that the entitled heir's hatred wasn't really about business competition or property development. It was about class, privilege, and the fundamental belief that some people deserved to be destroyed simply for having the audacity to exist without permission. Real businesses, Thomas repeated thoughtfully. Tell me, Richard, what makes your business more real than mine? Everything, Richard replied with vicious satisfaction. Money, connections, influence, the kind of power that actually matters. In the real world, not this pathetic fantasy where you pretend that working with your hands makes you anything more than hired help. The insult was designed to be the killing blow, the final humiliation that would force Thomas to acknowledge his proper place in Richard's social hierarchy. But as the words echoed across the garage, Thomas felt something fundamental shift inside. His chest. 8 years of choosing humility over power, 8 years of accepting disrespect to maintain his cover, 8 years of protecting a secret that had cost him more than Richard could possibly imagine. All of it was ending now, in this moment, surrounded by people who'd been brave enough to stand with him, despite their limited resources. Thomas Phillips, master mechanic, was about to introduce Richard Worthington Jr. to Thomas Mitchell, the man who actually owned everything Richard thought gave him authority. "You want to talk about real power?" Thomas asked, his voice carrying a new quality that made even the government inspectors stop what they were doing to listen. "Let's talk about real power." Thomas walked to his office with deliberate calm while everyone watched, sensing that something fundamental was about to change. He opened the bottom drawer of his desk and removed a cell phone that none of them had ever seen before. Sleek, expensive, the kind carried by people who made decisions that affected thousands of lives. His fingers moved across the screen with practiced efficiency as he placed a call that would reshape everything Richard thought he understood about power. "Sarah, this is Thomas Mitchell," he said clearly, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent garage. "I need you to initiate Protocol 7 immediately. Full disclosure, complete documentation, emergency board meeting within 2 hours." Richard's expression shifted from angry satisfaction to confused concern as he processed the authoritative tone and unfamiliar name. The confident heir who'd been gloating moments earlier now looked like someone trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces. "Also, Sarah, contact Detective Morrison at the Ridgefield Police Department. Tell him I have evidence of organized harassment, regulatory manipulation, and conspiracy to commit fraud. I'll be filing formal complaints within the hour." Thomas ended the call and turned to face Richard with eyes that had lost all trace of the humble mechanic's deference. "Who the hell is Thomas Mitchell?" Richard demanded, though his voice carried a tremor that suggested he was beginning to suspect the answer wouldn't be pleasant. "Thomas Mitchell is the managing partner of Mitchell Holdings, LLC," Thomas replied calmly. "The company that owns 73% of Worthington Luxury Motors through a complex web of investment vehicles and shell corporations." The garage fell completely silent as the implications hit everyone simultaneously. Richard's face went through a progression of emotions: confusion, disbelief, horror, and finally a kind of sickened understanding that his entire world was collapsing around him. "That's impossible," Richard whispered, but his voice lacked conviction. "My family owns Worthington Motors. My grandfather built that company from nothing. Your grandfather sold controlling interest to my investment group 5 years ago when the company faced bankruptcy during the recession," Thomas explained with professional precision. "The sale was structured to allow your family to maintain operational control while providing the capital injection necessary for survival." Maria stared at Thomas with wide eyes, processing the revelation that her boss was actually one of the wealthiest men in the region. Roberto's mouth hung open as he tried to reconcile the grease-stained mechanic who taught him about honest work with a corporate executive who controlled automotive empires. Dr. Williams recovered first, her medical training helping her process shocking information without losing focus. So, when Richard's been trying to destroy your business, he's actually been attacking his own ultimate boss. Exactly, Thomas confirmed. Every threat, every harassment campaign, every attempt to force me out of business has been directed against the person who controls his family's livelihood, his inheritance, and his future in the automotive industry. Jake Thompson stepped away from Richard with obvious horror, finally understanding the full magnitude of his employer's stupidity. Mr. Worthington, you've been trying to destroy the man who actually owns the company. You've been harassing your own primary shareholder. Richard's legs seemed to give out as he sank onto a nearby chair, his face pale with the realization of what he'd done. But why? Why are you working as a mechanic if you own the dealership? Why didn't you tell me who you were? Because 8 years ago, I lost my wife to cancer, Thomas replied quietly, his voice carrying the weight of grief that had driven his life choices. Sarah had always said that money without purpose was meaningless, that real satisfaction came from building things with your own hands. After she died, I needed to understand what she meant. The personal revelation added emotional depth to what could have been simply a business reversal. Thomas wasn't just a wealthy man playing games. With identity, he was someone who'd chosen authentic work over inherited privilege as a way of honoring his wife's memory. I came to Ridgefield because I wanted to remember what it felt like to solve problems directly, to help people with immediate needs, rather than manipulating numbers on quarterly reports, Thomas continued. I kept my ownership stake because someone needed to ensure that companies like Worthington Motors treated their employees and customers fairly. Frank McMahon whistled softly. Tom or Thomas or whoever you are, you've been living like one of us while secretly being one of them. That takes more courage than I ever imagined. I am one of you, Thomas replied firmly. The money doesn't change the fact that I choose to work with my hands, that I value the relationships I've built in this community, that I believe honest. Labor has dignity regardless of how much wealth someone might have accumulated. Inspector Williams, who'd been listening with growing amazement, stepped forward with her official report. Mr. Mitchell, I need to apologize for my agency's participation in what was clearly a harassment campaign. If you file complaints about regulatory manipulation, the health department will cooperate fully with any investigation. The other inspectors nodded agreement, clearly recognizing that they'd been used as weapons in someone else's business war. Their embarrassment was obvious as they understood how their official authority had been perverted to serve private vendettants. Richard suddenly stood up, his face flushed with desperate anger. This doesn't change anything. You can't fire me for trying to acquire properties legally. Business competition isn't illegal, and neither is real estate development. Actually, Richard, several laws have been broken, Thomas replied calmly. Conspiracy to commit fraud, filing false complaints with government agencies, harassment, and probably criminal conspiracy given the coordination with Derek Walsh's development company. David Price, who'd been silent during the revelation, finally spoke up. Mr. Mitchell, I have recordings of Mr. Worthington discussing his plans to destroy your business. He specifically mentioned using false complaints and regulatory pressure to force you into bankruptcy. The evidence of criminal intent provided by Richard's own employee seemed to deflate whatever remaining defiance he'd been clinging to. Jake. Thompson nodded grimly. I can confirm those conversations. Mr. Worthington made it clear that he was targeting you personally, not just conducting normal business competition. Plus, Dr. Williams added, consulting her research folder, I have documentation proving that this harassment campaign follows an identical pattern used against 17 other small businesses. That establishes systematic criminal behavior rather than isolated incidents. Thomas pulled out his phone again, placing another call that Richard could hear clearly. Detective Morrison, this is Thomas Mitchell. I'm ready to file formal complaints against Richard Worthington Jr., Derek Walsh, Howard Phillips, and their associated companies for criminal conspiracy, fraud, and organized harassment. As Thomas provided details of the evidence package he'd be delivering, Richard seemed to shrink into himself, finally understanding the complete scope of his miscalculation. He'd declared war on someone who possessed not only the financial resources to destroy him, but also the legal authority and documented evidence necessary to pursue criminal charges. The board meeting I called will convene at 2 o'clock this afternoon, Thomas announced to the assembled group. The first item of business will be the immediate termination of Richard Worthington Jr. from all positions within Worthington Luxury Motors and its affiliated companies. You can't do that, Richard protested weakly. My family has contracts, agreements, guaranteed positions within the company structure. Those agreements were negotiated with your grandfather, who no longer has authority to enforce them. Thomas replied with corporate precision. As majority shareholder, I have the right to restructure management as necessary to protect the company's interests and reputation. Jake Thompson straightened his shoulders with obvious relief. Mr. Mitchell, if you need someone to oversee day-to-day operations while you recruit new management, I'd be honored to help with the transition. Thank you, Jake. Your integrity during this difficult period hasn't gone unnoticed, Thomas replied. I'll definitely want to discuss expanded responsibilities with you. The immediate reorganization of Richard's entire professional world was happening with stunning efficiency. Within minutes, he'd gone from entitled heir expecting to inherit an automotive empire to unemployed harassment defendant facing criminal charges. What about the rest of the family? Richard asked desperately. My mother, my sisters, they weren't involved in any of this. Your family members who weren't involved in harassment campaigns will be treated fairly, Thomas assured him. But they'll need to earn their positions based on competence and contribution, rather than simply expecting inherited privileges. Maria approached Thomas cautiously, her expression mixing amazement with the practical concerns of someone whose livelihood depended on understanding the changing situation. Thomas, what does this mean for the shop? For Roberto and me? It means Phillips Auto Repair continues exactly as it has, Thomas replied warmly. This is still my chosen work, my way of staying connected to the community I've come to love. The only difference is that Richard Worthington Jr. will no longer be able to threaten the people I care about. Roberto's face lit up with understanding. So you're still going to teach me about engines and honest work, even though you're secretly a millionaire? I'm still going to teach you everything I know, Thomas confirmed, because the money doesn't change the value of learning skills with your hands, or the satisfaction of solving problems directly, or the importance of treating every customer with respect, regardless of their economic status. Frank McMahon laughed with obvious delight. Tom, you're the most interesting friend I've ever had. 8 years of drinking coffee with a secret millionaire who chose to live like the rest of us working folks. Not like you, Thomas corrected. With you, this community, these relationships, this work, it's all real. The money just ensures that people like Richard can't destroy what we've built together. As Richard was escorted away by Detective Morrison, who'd arrived with remarkable speed, Thomas looked around at the faces of people who'd stood by him during the harassment campaign. Their loyalty had been given to the mechanic they believed him to be, not the wealthy executive he'd revealed himself to be. Does anyone have questions about what happens next? Thomas asked, understanding that the revelation would take time to process fully. Dr. Williams raised her hand with a slight smile. Just one question. Are you still going to charge reasonable prices for car repairs, or should we expect corporate "Mark up now that we know you don't actually need the money," Thomas laughed, feeling lighter than he had in months. "Same prices, same honest work, same commitment to this community. The only thing that changes is that nobody gets to threaten my family ever again." The education Richard had promised was finally complete, but the lesson had been very different from what he'd expected. He'd learned that some mechanics could indeed dismantle more than just engines. They could dismantle entire empires built on arrogance and unearned privilege. 6 weeks after the revelation, the Ridgefield County Courthouse buzzed with activity as the criminal trial of Richard Worthington Jr. reached its dramatic conclusion. The prosecution had presented overwhelming evidence of systematic harassment, conspiracy to commit fraud, and organized criminal enterprise involving 17 separate business targets across 4 years of predatory practices. Thomas sat in the witness gallery wearing a clean button-down shirt and slacks, having testified earlier about the harassment campaign directed against Phillips Auto Repair. His calm recounting of events had provided crucial first-hand evidence of Richard's systematic approach to destroying small businesses through coordinated regulatory and media attacks. Maria Castillo took the stand as the prosecution's final witness, her voice strong and clear as she described the impact of Richard's campaign on her family. "My son Roberto faced harassment at school because of lies spread about where I work. These people tried to destroy an honest business and hurt innocent families just to make money from real estate development." The defense attorney, James Blackwood, had struggled throughout the trial to counter the documented evidence of criminal coordination between Richard, Derek Walsh, and Howard Phillips. Phone records, email communications, and witness testimony painted an undeniable picture of deliberate harassment disguised as legitimate business practice. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Prosecutor Amanda Clark addressed the 12 citizens who would determine Richard's fate. "The evidence shows a pattern of criminal behavior designed to terrorize small business owners into surrendering their livelihoods. The defendants thought their wealth and connections placed them above the law. Judge Patricia Hayes had maintained strict control over proceedings while ensuring that both sides received fair hearings. Her instructions to the jury emphasized the distinction between legitimate business competition and criminal conspiracy to commit fraud through abuse of government regulatory processes. The jury deliberated for 3 hours before returning with verdicts that sent shockwaves through Ridgefield's business community. Richard Worthington Jr. was found guilty on all counts: conspiracy to commit fraud, filing false official complaints, criminal harassment, and racketeering. Derek Walsh and Howard Phillips received similar convictions for their roles in the organized scheme. "Mr. Worthington," Judge Hayes addressed the former heir during sentencing, "your systematic campaign to destroy legitimate businesses demonstrates a callous disregard for the law and basic human decency. This court sentences you to 18 months in state prison, followed by 3 years of supervised probation." The courtroom erupted in mixed reactions as Richard's remaining family members absorbed the reality of his incarceration. His mother, Angela Worthington, sat in stunned silence, while his sisters Elizabeth and Victoria struggled to process how their brother's arrogance had led to criminal conviction and family disgrace. Outside the courthouse, Thomas spoke briefly with reporters who'd covered the trial extensively. "Justice has been served, but the real victory is that small business owners can now operate without fear of this kind of systematic intimidation. No one should face economic terrorism for choosing to work honestly in their community." Dr. Williams approached Thomas after the media dispersed, carrying a folder containing the latest updates on the civil lawsuits filed by the 17 businesses that had been targeted by Richard's conspiracy. The class action settlement negotiations are proceeding well. Most of the affected business owners should receive substantial compensation for the damages they suffered. The financial settlements would help restore the livelihoods that Richard's campaign had destroyed, but Thomas understood that some losses couldn't be measured in dollars. Families had been separated when businesses failed. Communities had lost gathering places when long-time establishments closed, and people's faith in justice had been tested by systematic abuse of power. Jake Thompson, now serving as interim president of Worthington Luxury Motors, joined them with quarterly reports showing the company's remarkable turnaround under ethical management. Sales are up 30% since we implemented the new customer service standards you recommended. Treating people with respect, regardless of their economic status, has been incredibly good for business. The transformation of Worthington Motors had surprised industry observers who'd assumed that aggressive sales tactics were necessary for luxury vehicle profitability. Thomas's emphasis on building genuine relationships rather than exploiting customer insecurities had created a more sustainable business model while improving employee morale significantly. The service department staff particularly appreciates the new policies about treating independent mechanics as colleagues rather than competitors, Jake continued. We've started referring customers to Phillips Auto Repair for specialized work that we can't handle efficiently. The cooperation between the dealership and Thomas's garage had created a partnership that benefited everyone involved. Customers received the best possible service regardless of where their needs were addressed. Mechanics shared knowledge and resources, and the artificial barriers between luxury and working-class automotive services began dissolving. Frank McMahon organized a community celebration at his diner that evening, inviting everyone who'd supported Thomas during the harassment campaign. The modest restaurant overflowed with customers, neighbors, and friends who'd witnessed the triumph of determination over privilege, honesty over manipulation. "Tom showed us something important," Frank announced to the gathered crowd. "He proved that real strength comes from character, not from bank accounts or family connections. And he proved that communities can defeat bullies when people stand together." Roberto Castillo, now 18 and preparing for college, spoke about his plans to study automotive engineering while continuing to work part-time at Phillips Auto Repair. "Mr. Phillips taught me that honest work has dignity, regardless of what other people think about it. I want to design better engines, but I also want to understand how to fix them with my own hands." The young man's perspective reflected the broader impact of Thomas's example on Ridgefield's younger generation. Students throughout the school district had learned that wealth alone didn't determine someone's worth, that integrity mattered more than inheritance, and that standing up to bullies was possible when communities supported each other. Carol Phillips, Thomas's sister, attended the celebration for the first time since the revelation of his double life. She'd known about his decision to work as a mechanic, but had worried that the experiment was preventing him from processing his grief properly. "I was wrong to think that hiding from wealth was unhealthy," Carol admitted privately to Thomas. "You didn't hide from anything. You found a way to honor Sarah's values while using your resources to protect people who couldn't protect themselves." The reconciliation with his sister removed the last personal barrier to Thomas's integration of his two identities. He no longer needed to choose between being Thomas Phillips the mechanic and Thomas Mitchell the executive. He could be both, using each role to complement and strengthen the other. Jennifer Baker, the reporter who'd initially participated in Richard's media campaign, approached Thomas with obvious embarrassment about her previous coverage. "Mr. Mitchell, I want to apologize for the articles I wrote based on false information. I should have investigated the sources more thoroughly before publishing allegations." "Apology accepted," Thomas replied graciously. "But I hope you've learned Something about the difference between legitimate journalism and propaganda disguised as news reporting. Baker's subsequent investigative series about predatory business practices had earned regional recognition while helping expose similar schemes in neighboring communities. Her experience with Richard's manipulation had transformed her from a reporter who accepted information uncritically into an investigative journalist who verified sources meticulously. Detective Ray Morrison joined the celebration carrying updates about the broader investigation that Richard's conviction had triggered. We've identified similar harassment patterns in 3 other counties. Your decision to document everything and fight back has helped us build cases against organized business, crime throughout the region. The ripple effects of Thomas's resistance were expanding beyond Ridgefield, encouraging other small business owners to report suspicious regulatory pressure and providing law enforcement with the evidence needed to combat systematic economic intimidation. Mayor William Foster announced the City Council's unanimous decision to implement new oversight procedures for commercial property complaints, ensuring that anonymous allegations would require corroborating evidence before triggering official investigations. The abuse of regulatory processes to serve private interests will not be tolerated in Ridgefield. The policy changes would protect future small business owners from the kind of harassment that Thomas had endured, creating safeguards against the weaponization of government authority for personal vendettas. David Price, who'd risked his career to provide crucial intelligence about Richard's plans, accepted a promotion to regional manager for the restructured Worthington Motors. His moral courage during the crisis had demonstrated the leadership qualities that Thomas valued more than technical expertise or family connections. I learned that doing the right thing sometimes requires personal risk, David reflected. But I also learned that standing up to bullies creates opportunities that wouldn't exist otherwise. As the evening wound down, Thomas found himself surrounded by the community he'd chosen 8 years earlier, when grief had driven him to seek meaning beyond corporate success. The relationships that Richard had tried to destroy through systematic harassment had emerged stronger, united by shared resistance to intimidation and common commitment to fairness. The shop reopens for normal business tomorrow morning, Thomas announced to the gathering. Same hours, same services, same commitment. To treating every customer with respect, regardless of what they drive or how much money they have. The return to routine work represented more than business resumption. It symbolized the victory of authentic community over manufactured controversy, honest labor over inherited privilege, and local solidarity over external manipulation. Maria approached him with Roberto and her husband Carlos, who'd returned from military deployment just in time to witness the conclusion of the harassment campaign. Thomas, you gave us more than jobs. You gave us hope that decent people can win when they stick together. As the celebration ended and people began heading home through Ridgefield's quiet streets, Thomas reflected on the education that Richard had promised but never received. The entitled heir had learned about consequences and accountability, but he'd never understood the deeper lesson about the difference between power and authority, between inherited privilege and earned respect. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, but tonight belonged to the community that had proven stronger than any individual attempt to divide and intimidate them. Thomas Phillips, master mechanic and secret millionaire, had found his way home to the life that honored both his wife's memory and his own values. The real education had belonged to everyone who'd witnessed the triumph of character over circumstance, demonstrating that some victories were worth more than any amount of money could measure. 1 year later, Phillips Auto Repair had evolved into something unprecedented in Ridgefield's business community, a garage that served luxury vehicles and working trucks with equal expertise, bridging economic divides that had previously seemed insurmountable. The waiting area displayed photographs of satisfied customers, ranging from factory workers to bank presidents, all receiving the same quality service and respectful treatment. Thomas worked under the hood of a pristine Bentley, while Roberto, now a freshman engineering student, assisted with the precision fuel injection calibration. The same hands that had been dismissed as too crude for luxury vehicle work now performed maintenance that dealership technicians regularly sought his advice to complete properly. The fuel mixture sensor needs micro-adjustment, Roberto observed, consulting the diagnostic tablet that Thomas had added to their equipment arsenal. The owner mentioned subtle performance issues during acceleration. "Good catch," Thomas replied, making the delicate modification with movements that demonstrated 8 years of accumulated expertise. "Remember, expensive cars still follow the same mechanical principles as economy vehicles. The parts cost more, but the physics doesn't change." Maria managed the expanding business from behind a new computer system that tracked customer preferences, maintenance schedules, and parts inventory with corporate efficiency. Her role had evolved far beyond simple appointment scheduling as Thomas recognized her natural talent for operations management and business development. "Mrs. Patterson called to thank you personally for the brake job," Maria reported, updating their customer satisfaction database. She said the difference in pedal response was remarkable, and she's recommending us to her book club members. The word-of-mouth recommendations had become Phillips Auto Repair's primary marketing strategy, generating steady growth through genuine customer satisfaction rather than advertising campaigns. Thomas's reputation for honest diagnosis and fair pricing had spread throughout 3 counties, attracting customers who valued integrity over convenience. Dr. Williams entered carrying coffee and wearing the comfortable expression of someone visiting friends rather than conducting business. Her monthly visits had become informal community gatherings where neighbors shared updates about their lives, their vehicles, and their perspectives on Ridgefield's continuing transformation. The Medical Center Board approved funding for the Automotive Technology Scholarship Program, Dr. Williams announced with obvious satisfaction. Roberto will be our first recipient, with full tuition support for his engineering degree, plus guaranteed internship placement. The scholarship program represented Thomas's quiet way of ensuring that other young people would have opportunities to combine technical education with hands-on experience. His anonymous funding provided resources that local families couldn't otherwise afford, creating pathways to economic advancement through skilled trades and engineering education. "Dr. Williams, that's incredible," Roberto said, his voice thick with emotion. "I won't let you down. I won't let Mr. Phillips down. I won't let anyone down. You already make us proud every day," Thomas replied firmly. "Your curiosity, your work ethic, your respect for everyone who comes through that door, those qualities matter more than any degree program." Frank McMahon arrived with lunch and newspapers from 3 different cities, all featuring follow-up stories about the business harassment prosecutions that had grown from Richard's original conspiracy. The legal precedents established through the Ridgefield case were being cited in similar investigations across multiple states. "Tom, look at this," Frank said, spreading the Pittsburgh Tribune on the workbench. "Another development company got arrested for the same kind of harassment scheme. The prosecutor specifically mentioned your case as the blueprint for identifying organized business intimidation." The regional impact had surprised Thomas, who'd initially focused only on protecting his chosen community from Richard's attacks. The documentation and legal strategies developed during his resistance had become models for combating predatory business practices throughout the industrial Midwest. Jake Thompson stopped by during his lunch break from Worthington Motors, carrying quarterly reports that showed continued growth under ethical management principles. The dealership's transformation had become a case study for automotive industry publications interested in sustainable business practices. Customer satisfaction scores are the highest in our company's history, Jake reported proudly. The service department particularly benefits from our partnership with Phillips Auto Repair. Customers appreciate having options that match their specific needs and budget requirements. The cooperation between luxury dealership and neighborhood garage had eliminated artificial barriers that previously forced customers to choose between expensive dealer service and potentially unreliable independent mechanics. Thomas's reputation for quality work allowed Worthington Motors to offer comprehensive automotive care, regardless of vehicle age or customer income level. Carol Phillips arrived unexpectedly, carrying a large envelope and wearing the nervous expression of someone about to make an important announcement. Thomas's sister had maintained cautious distance during his double life years, but had become increasingly supportive since his identity revelation. "Thomas, I have something to discuss with you," Carol said formally. "Something I should have mentioned months ago, but I wasn't sure how you'd react." She opened the envelope and removed architectural drawings for an expanded automotive facility that would combine advanced diagnostic equipment with traditional mechanical expertise. The proposed complex included training classrooms, customer education areas, and space for the scholarship program that Thomas had been funding quietly. "I've been working with David Price and some investors to develop this concept," Carol explained. "A place where people can learn automotive skills regardless of their economic background, where traditional mechanics and modern technology can coexist productively." Thomas studied the detailed plans, recognizing his sister's talent for combining practical functionality with aesthetic appeal. The proposed facility would serve as both working garage and educational center, creating opportunities for knowledge transfer between experienced mechanics and emerging technicians. "The funding is already secured," Carol continued. "Anonymous donors who were inspired by your example want to support expanded automotive education throughout the region." The anonymous donors were actually Thomas himself, working through Carol to create institutional structures that would outlast his personal involvement. His wealth was being channeled into sustainable programs that would continue benefiting communities long after individual circumstances changed. "Where would we build?" "Something like this," Thomas asked, though he was already imagining the possibilities for expanded community service. "The old Morrison manufacturing site," David Price answered, entering with blueprints of his own. "It's been vacant for 3 years since the plant closure, but the infrastructure is perfect for automotive training. Rail access for parts delivery, heavy electrical service for diagnostic equipment, and enough space for both classroom and practical instruction." The industrial site would provide room for growth while maintaining connection to Ridgefield's working-class heritage. Converting abandoned manufacturing space into educational facility would symbolize the community's evolution toward knowledge-based industry without abandoning its blue-collar values. Jennifer Baker arrived with her photographer, documenting the planning session for a feature story about community-driven economic development. Her coverage of Thomas's story had evolved into ongoing reporting about small-town innovation and grassroots business cooperation. "This represents something unique in rural economic development," Baker observed, taking notes while her photographer captured the collaborative planning process. "Private investment supporting public education, traditional skills enhanced by modern technology, and community needs driving institutional design. The media attention would help attract additional resources and partnerships, But Thomas insisted that publicity focus on program benefits rather than personal recognition. His commitment to remaining behind the scenes reflected lessons learned during 8 years of choosing substance over visibility. Roberto spread his engineering textbooks across the workbench, comparing theoretical knowledge with practical applications. He'd observed during months of working alongside Thomas. Professor Martinez says automotive engineering is moving toward hybrid systems that combine mechanical and electronic components. This facility could train people to work on technologies that don't even exist yet. The forward-thinking approach would ensure that students developed adaptable skills rather than just learning specific procedures. Thomas's experience bridging traditional mechanics with corporate innovation provided valuable perspective on balancing technological advancement with fundamental competencies. Mayor Foster stopped by to discuss zoning approvals and municipal support for the proposed educational facility. The City Council had unanimously endorsed the project as exactly the kind of economic development that Ridgefield needed to diversify beyond traditional manufacturing. This project represents everything we hoped would happen when we updated our commercial development policies, Mayor Foster explained. Private initiative, creating public benefit, economic opportunity without environmental degradation, and community investment that builds long-term prosperity. The municipal partnership would provide infrastructure support and regulatory streamlining, ensuring that bureaucratic procedures enhanced rather than hindered the educational mission. Thomas's experience with regulatory harassment had taught him the importance of transparent government cooperation in legitimate development projects. As afternoon sunlight slanted through the garage windows, Thomas looked around at the gathering of people who'd become his chosen family during 8 years of life as a working mechanic. The relationships that Richard had tried to destroy through systematic intimidation had evolved into collaborative partnerships that were creating opportunities for entire communities. "I want everyone to understand something important," Thomas announced to the assembled group. "This facility, these programs, these opportunities, they're not charity. They're investments in people who have the courage to learn skills that matter, to build things that last, to contribute to communities that value honest work." The distinction was crucial to Thomas's philosophy about wealth and responsibility. His resources were being used to create pathways to economic independence rather than dependency, empowering people to solve their own problems rather than requiring ongoing assistance. Maria approached with the day's final customer invoice, a routine transaction that represented the continuing success of the simple automotive repair business that had started everything. "Mrs. Henderson picked up her transmission. She wanted me to tell you that her car runs better now than it did when she bought it new." The customer satisfaction reflected standards that Thomas had maintained, regardless of whether he was working on economy vehicles or luxury machines. His commitment to excellence had never been about impressing wealthy customers. It had always been about respecting the people who trusted him with their transportation needs. As the day ended and people began heading home through Ridgefield's familiar streets, Thomas reflected on the journey that had brought him from corporate boardrooms to automotive bays to educational planning sessions. The path hadn't been linear, but it had been authentic, honoring both his wife's values and his own need to find meaning beyond financial accumulation. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, but tonight belonged to the community that had taught him about the difference between having power and using it wisely. The humble mechanic who'd been dismissed as a poor nobody had proven that some forms of wealth couldn't be measured in bank accounts, that some kinds of success couldn't be inherited, and that some lessons about human dignity could only be learned Through honest work, performed with integrity, Richard Worthington Jr. had promised an education about power and respect. The lesson had been delivered, but the teacher had been Thomas Phillips, and the curriculum had covered subjects that no amount of inherited privilege could ever fully comprehend. The story of the poor mechanic who secretly owned everything was ending, but the story of the community that had discovered its own strength was just beginning. The end. Up next, 2 more incredible stories are waiting for you right on your screen. If you enjoyed this one, you won't want to miss this. Just click to watch, and don't forget to subscribe. It would mean a lot.